most conflicts happen, or rather happen and do not get resolved, because people feel that the first person to go and try to resolve it is the loser. And if you really think about it, the first person who tries to go and resolve is the first person who wants that relationship to win. And I think it starts with a flip in perspective. You trying to initiate a conversation where you're trying to resolve something is you being the bigger person who is keeping the larger relationship in mind and not the smaller ego of only yours in mind.
This is episode number 77 of The Inspiring Talk with Siddharth Anantharam. Welcome guys to The Inspiring Talk. My name is Gautam. I'm host for this show. Each week I interview today's most successful and inspiring personalities to help you realize your inner potential. Thank you so much, my friend, for joining me on this episode of the Inspiring Talk podcast. I know it's been a while since I released the last episode. Some of you have even emailed me, sent me Instagram DMs asking, is everything all right? Hey, why have we not released the episodes? Thank you so much for all the love. I'm totally fine. I've just been traveling and conducting workshops and got caught up with a lot of stuff. But, that's a big but, by the way. I have promised myself not to miss a single episode from now on. Yes, not a single one. Whatever it takes. Thank you once again for all the love and support. I truly appreciate it and I take it seriously. And I mean it. I'm very pumped for my guest, Siddharth Anantharam. He is a master at curating meaningful conversations that help people connect deeply with themselves and with each other. Asking powerful questions is his superpower, and he uses it as often as possible to help people discover theirs. As the founder of Life Circles, Siddharth hosts transformational spaces that combine meaningful conversations, games, and unforgettable experiences to help communities find clarity and seek new perspectives. He is also the business head of Evercoach by Mindvalley, the world's hottest personal transformation company, a TEDx speaker, and a life coach. In a world that is hyper-connected yet lonely, Siddharth is on a mission to build healthier communities where people have conversations that matter, shed their mental wealth, and live a lighter life. On our conversation, we discuss how you can have meaningful conversations with people that matters the most to you. How you can start, drive, and end the conversation, and a lot more. Before we jump in, I would really appreciate if you could take a screenshot and share it on your Instagram story. And when you do that, don't forget to tag me at @Bijay Speaks. Now, enjoy the conversation. Welcome back inside this episode, guys. I'm super excited to have with me here my friend Sid. Sid, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on this podcast, Bijay. I have heard so much good stuff about it. I'm so happy to be on the show and to speak to your listeners and to speak to you. And excited for this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited for this conversation. So just to give listeners the perspective on how I met Sid, was at this festival called Life Plugin in Goa on October, if I'm not wrong, right?
Yeah.
And here we are connecting again at another festival. It's called F of X Festival. And we are here in this beautiful Jim Corbett National Park. And we're having this conversation about having conversation.
Yeah.
And when I asked Sid, hey, how are we going to structure this conversation? And he threw me this challenge saying, hey, because this podcast is about, you want to do this episode about conversation, let's just have conversation on this podcast. So tell me, have you always had conversation with people? Were you always good at having conversation all your life? Or what was it for you?
I think for the longest time, I've always enjoyed conversations with people. Mm-hmm. And it took me a while to discover why. And I think in the last 1 year or a little more than that, I have gone deep into studying conversations. And I've come to the understanding that the reason why I love conversations so much is because of a certain belief I have. And the belief I have is that I look at the world and I see that the whole world is my classroom. And I feel that the people who I meet in this classroom are my biggest teachers. And conversations for me are the biggest tools that help me understand myself and these people better. And ever since I was a kid, I've always been very, very curious about understanding people. What really gets them going? What lights up their day? What makes them come alive? And what's their story like? And what made them become who they are? And I feel like conversations is the single most powerful yet underutilized tool for us to help understand each other better. So yes, to answer your question, I've always been something that a person who loves conversations. And in the last few years, I've just become more and more curious about exploring what really makes great conversations, and most importantly, what makes conversations more meaningful.
Yeah. So I think that's the part where I wanted to spend majority of time on this particular episode. Like, how do you have those meaningful conversations with people, so that you can connect not just on a surface level, but a level deep down there. And probably we'll talk about like where the conversation leads, and probably you can share some of the most amazing conversations that you have had in your life. But when it comes to meaningful conversation, if I have to recall when I had probably one of the most meaningful conversations was after being on your session, at Life Plugin in Goa on October. So after that event, and obviously at that activity workshop, is that the right word? Workshop,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So the workshop that you conducted, and after that, or the board game that we played, right? And after that, I stayed back in Goa with a couple of friends there who were strangers. Now they are friends, obviously.
Nice.
And I stayed back there, and the kind of conversation that we had, and the way I connected with those strangers, and then I have never felt that with any other friends that I've had like in my entire life. The kind of chats that we were having, the kind of the layers that we were peeling of each other, and also allowing other person to enter our world. So that was like one of the most powerful conversations that I've ever had. But I'm still trying to figure out why I was able to have those kind of conversations at that point of time, and what are probably some of the things that that makes conversation meaningful.
Great question. And I think this is the exact question that I have spent the majority of the last 3 or 4 years trying to figure. Before I answer that, I want to give you a little bit of backstory of why I was trying to figure this. Right? Why was this question relevant or important for me?
Yeah.
And this question was relevant or important for me. And I'm speaking to your listeners, and I'm sure within your listeners there are people who want to have a meaningful conversation with some of their closest friends about something that matters to them. Or if there are wives and husbands, you want to have a really meaningful conversation with your partner about something that you either disagree on or something that really matters to you as well. Or conversations with your parents. I found myself in a place personally where I wanted to have a really tough conversation with my partner, and I found myself struggling. I found myself in a place where I wanted to say I forgive you to a friend, and I found myself struggling. And I also found myself in a place where I wanted to express myself to my parents and say I love you, but I couldn't find the words. Each one of these for me are meaningful conversations that really make you stop and changes your perspective. These are also difficult conversations, but there are other kind of meaningful conversations as well, where you are expressing things that's on your mind, that matters most to you, your feelings, your emotions.
True.
And when I was struggling with having these conversations, something shaped in me. I was like, I have been the person who throughout my life loves having conversations. Yet, when it comes to these topics, why am I finding it so hard? And this is what made me go down the rabbit hole of understanding what really makes conversations meaningful. And all my research and all the work I've done with multiple communities and all the study that I've done has led me to 3 things. And I call these the 3 ingredients for cooking a meaningful conversation.
Beautiful.
And these 3 ingredients are, the first one is, I've realized, is honesty. Blatant honesty. Meaningful conversations happen when you enter the conversation and are willing to be blatantly honest with the other people you're speaking to. And what I mean by blatantly honest is you're willing to say, whatever I'm going to say might hurt the other person, but yet I'm willing to be totally honest. And the reason why this is so important is, in today's world, most of us are afraid of having meaningful conversations because you're afraid to be blatantly honest with the people some mostly care for.
Yeah.
And because we know if we do that, we might end up hurting them or rubbing them in the wrong way. And so we shirk away from being honest. And the moment we are dishonest, or not even dishonest, but the moment we are not completely honest and we hold back, the conversation right there becomes less meaningful. So that's the first thing I've learned, honesty. The second thing I've learned is that a meaningful conversation is one in which you're willing to be vulnerable. And I know the word vulnerable gets thrown around a lot.
True.
But vulnerability for me, I've realized, is entering a conversation where you're willing to take the risk of not knowing the outcome.
Yeah.
And this is precisely the reason why I told you before we started this conversation, instead of structuring it or thinking about it, let's just start the conversation because this is vulnerability.
Yeah.
Where you enter a conversation not knowing where it's going to lead.
True.
And doing that takes guts and courage and takes both the people or the more people in the conversation to take the risk of saying, we don't know where this is going to go, but let's just have it anyway.
Yeah.
So that's the second thing, vulnerability. And then the last aspect and the most important aspect is a meaningful conversation is one in which perspectives are exchanged. See, we see all of us look at the world through a pair of glasses.
Yeah.
Both of us wear glasses. So for us, this is normal, right? But even those of us who don't have physical glasses, we actually are looking at the world through a pair of lenses that have shaped us. Our beliefs, the way we brought up, the experiences we've had, our stories. And for me, a conversation is a beautiful way for us to exchange a pair of glasses. For me, if I handed my glass to you and you gave yours to me, I'm looking at the world through the lens you've been looking at. And a conversation allows us to do that. So a meaningful conversation is one in which three things, like I have to say, I'm going to repeat myself. Honesty, vulnerability, and perspective is exchanged. And this, I feel, every time these three enter a conversation, the conversation becomes all the more meaningful.
So for the cases like where you mentioned, you want to have difficult conversations, whether with your partner or whether that's with your parents or whether with anyone, like you want to have that conversation, right? So let's say that you want to have a conversation with someone, probably you have, and I think one of the reasons probably people hold back from having that conversation or putting themselves out and being vulnerable there is the fear of judgment.
Correct.
Right? And what would the person think of me, or think about the perspective that I'm trying to, bring on the table? Right? How do you get past that?
In all my research and all my study of conversations and in all communities, the number one thing I have learned is that the biggest thing that stops people from speaking about the things that really matter to them is fear of judgment. The fear that people will judge them, of course, the fear that people will, the perception that they of other people have of them will be shaken. And the fear that once that's done, people will look at them differently, right? And when people ask me how to get over the fear of judgment, my simple answer is you will never be able to, because the fear of judgment is something that is intrinsically humane, right? Everyone has the fear of people judging them. And the biggest thing that we as human beings need is validation.
Yes.
And that is what makes us human. However, what you can do is try to reduce it. And what I've learned, the number one thing that helps you reduce it is when you want to speak about something that really matters to you, start with a stranger. Speak about it to a stranger. Because what happens with a stranger is that there are no barriers, no preconceived notions. And in that case, you get the courage to speak and share openly everything that's in your heart and mind right now. And if you've wondered, and I'm sure the listeners on the show, you guys have always found it easier to speak about something that's happening for you in your life more openly to a stranger than to your own friends and family.
Yeah.
Because that there is no fear of judgment there, right? So I've often had people who've started off speaking about something that matters to them with a stranger and then found the courage from that to now approach their friends and then to move towards their family. And some people say, hey, but isn't that me being inauthentic because I'm starting with a stranger first and I don't have the courage to do it with my own friends and family? I say no, because courage is something I've realized that gets built step by step over time. And the process of having these conversations also requires courage. And the first step towards seeking that courage is by having it with a stranger. And I've had so many people who've done it I run something called life circles where I create spaces where people have these conversations with strangers. And I've had so many people attend life circles and then go back home and have these same conversations with their closest friends. and with their siblings, with their partners, and with their family. And they come back and tell me, thank you for creating that space there, because that gave me the courage to say, hey, if I could have that with a stranger, I know I can now have it with close friend and family. So I would say number one step is, if you're afraid of speaking about something and you feel you're going to get judged, find a stranger, share everything that's in your heart, and see the courage that it gives you, and then move towards friends and family.
I can agree more on the practicing that with a stranger, because that's where actually you are building your muscle, right?
Correct.
So that to just get over the fear that you have. Now I want to take a step back. Like, this is about like how you have meaningful conversations, and the elements of it which you have shared are honesty, vulnerability, and perspective.
Correct.
Right. So I want to take a step back. And early on this conversation, you have mentioned that you want to have conversation with people and you want to express your emotions and feeling. Like, it need not necessarily be you being vulnerable. Like, just telling your parents that you love them. And I was having conversation with Raghava, and I told him that, it took me 21 years to walk up to my mom and tell her that I love you, like in the words. Otherwise, you don't know how do you express those, right? And then we do not express those. And like, how do you even start having the conversation, whether be it a stranger or be it somebody? Like, how do you start having conversation?
Okay. A lot of people struggle with exactly that stage.
Yep.
Because once they start, it goes smooth sailing mostly. But it's that starting, it's the starting problem, right? Classic starting problem, like in engines. I have a certain, just like I shared with you the ingredients for cooking, a meaningful conversation. You can't just have the right ingredients. You also need a tried and tested recipe.
True.
Right? And so think of this as the recipe for cooking a meaningful conversation. And the recipe starts with the first step. And the first step is something I call a check-in. A check-in is a way for you to spark a conversation. And a check-in is a way for you to also arrive into a conversation. You see, most of us enter a current conversation, although our minds are in the previous, or is something that's going to happen next, or something that happened before. Very few of us are right here, right now, and are completely present before starting a conversations. And because we are not completely present, we don't really know exactly what to say to a person. So check-in is a way for you to arrive into a conversation instead of jumping in. And my favorite way to do it is, what's on your mind? Because everyone has something on their mind. And the moment you ask someone that question, what it does is it clears out all the clutter. And it says, it's asked them, what's on your mind right now?
Yeah.
It makes them focus on the now, and it takes you immediately into the now. And suddenly, without trying to ask them anything about how you're feeling or anything else, or most conversations also start about work. You're not asking about work. You're just saying, hey, what's on your mind? There is a reason why that question is also on Facebook's feed. Share what's on your mind.
Yeah. Because
that question opens you up to a ton of different things. And it's one of my favorite ways to spark any conversation. So to answer your question, a check-in to the question, so what's on your mind, is one of my favorite ways to spark a conversation.
Yeah. So are there any other of those conversation spark, or something that when you just want to, probably, let's say you were walking to a random stranger, or somebody you met at an event with whom you want to walk up to, and you have no clue, how do you want to start the conversation with?
Yeah. So we've been trained to ask people, how are you doing? But the reason I don't ask that question is because we've also, our ears and our minds have also tuned out that question pretty much. When someone says, how are you doing? Each one of us has become so accustomed to saying, hey, good, or hey, great. Yeah. Because it becomes so natural because you don't even think. Yeah. Right? So I avoid that question completely. Instead, the other question I ask beyond what's on your mind is, hey, what's the most exciting thing that's happening in your life right now?
I think that's a good one. Like, sometimes, like, even asking, hey, what's on your mind, might be something like they would be like, okay, I mean, that's kind of a completely shock kind of, thing. Like, okay, they haven't expected that. Yeah. But what's the most exciting thing that's happening in your life probably is a really good one. Yeah. Because then people always love to talk about what's exciting thing that's happening, and the thing that they're passionate about.
Exactly. And it also creates enough space for people to talk about whatever they want to talk about, right? It can be their personal life, it can be their work, it can be the last dessert they had, anything. And it also gives you a clue about what excites people. Yeah. And why I also love that question is it raises the energy of any conversation. The moment the energy is raised, then you can take the conversation wherever it needs to go.
Yeah.
So that's another way to spark a great conversation.
Yeah. Great examples. So is there anything else that, we haven't discussed when it comes to starting a conversation? Probably, while approaching the person, or you might reach out to the person and probably other person might not be on that frame of mind.
Yeah.
Right? Or I'll keep juggling through having the conversation with a totally stranger and also probably having the meaningful conversation as well, right? Yeah. So you just messed something up with your partner and now you want to start that conversation probably, right?
Yeah.
And then you just can't go and have that conversation because the other person probably would not want to have that conversation at that point of time.
Yeah.
Right. So
I think that in a conversation, like I'm going back right now to the conversation I had, say, with one of my best friend. Once we had a conflict, right?
Yeah.
And I think my favorite way to do it is to start the conversation from trying to understand their day and the environment. So my favorite way to do it is, how was your day?
Okay.
Because irrespective of whatever conflict, that's a question that's very neutral.
Yeah.
It also, very often, that question is something we miss.
Yeah.
Because we feel like, again, we jump in, right? But the moment you ask someone, how was your day? And then you move on to discussing whatever it needs to be discussed, especially a conflict. Imagine that friend or that partner has had a terrible day with his or her boss.
Yeah.
Or has had a massive fight with her parent. And you directly jump into a conversation where you're trying to resolve a conflict.
Yeah.
Right? You don't even know what's happened. And now, if you don't know what's happened, obviously your conversation is going to go down south. Because what is actually on this person's mind is something very different.
Yeah.
It might not even be you, right? But the moment you ask a person, how was your day? This person tells you, Sid, I had a horrible day with my boss.
Yeah.
Right? I had this huge mess up that came up and this project just didn't work out. I automatically know I can decide one of two things. Either now is not the right time to have that conversation about resolving a conflict, or I first spend enough amount of time to give this other person the chance to express everything that happened during their day before I say, hey, by the way, I know we had a few things to talk about. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I love that one because you were just trying to understand what's on the other person's mind and what's happening in their world.
Exactly.
Before jumping in and probably. And I think that also works with when, even if you are going and having conversation with some stranger, you want to just go and have conversation and probably checking in.
Correct.
Even if that person is in mood to have that conversation or not, I think that sets the
right tone.
The right tone for the conversation. So there was another thing that I wanted to discuss. Again, it's about the conflict, right? So when you have this conflict and then let's say there are days or hours when people do not want to talk to each other at all, then how do you get past that ego that's there? Right? Because the person who's going to go and start that conversation has to fight through the ego that's in between, who's going to be the first person to go and have that conversation, right?
Yeah.
So how do you get past the ego on the conversation?
So I think most conflicts happen, or rather happen and do not get resolved, because people feel that the first person to go and try to resolve it is the loser.
Yeah.
And if you really think about it, the first person who tried to go and resolve is the first person who wants that relationship to win.
True.
And I think it starts with a flip in perspective. You trying to initiate a conversation where you're trying to resolve something is you being the bigger person who is keeping the larger relationship in mind and not the smaller ego of only yours in mind. And I think it starts with that flip in perspective. And most importantly, I think that the way you start a conversation, especially when it comes to a conflict, without keeping your ego in mind, is really checking in to say, hey, what matters most to me right now? What matters most to me right now? And I think I love the power of questions when it comes to conversations. Right. And this is a question that I ask myself often, which is, what matters most to me right now? And if in a conflict, the relationship matters more to me than how I'm feeling in that moment, I'm okay taking that first step to go and try to resolve it. Right. So at least that's how I've done it. And every time I've done it, I walked away feeling, thank God I didn't let my ego win.
Yeah.
And realized that meaningful conversations are a way for everyone to win. It just requires one person, if not both, to draw up that courage first. The same courage we spoke about.
Yeah.
And you drawing up the courage gives the other person the permission to do the same.
Yeah, I think that's a beautifully put, Siddharth. And The power of questions that you have mentioned, right?
Yeah.
And I have been on another, workshop on the same, like plugin where it was about the power of questions. And then that was also one of the beautiful experiences that I have had, asking the questions. And even after that, I have made this Instagram post saying, I have been asking people on this podcast for almost 2 years now, but I've never stopped to ask questions to myself.
Yeah.
And when I started asking that questions, which I now do often, I keep asking myself the questions. And that is one of the beautiful things. And I think that question about
What matters most?
Yes, what matters the most to me, and trying and saving that relationship rather than just winning that one tiny fight.
Yeah.
I think that says a lot about how probably you can get over your ego and then just go forward and have that conversation rather than saying that you are not losing, but the relationship
Is winning.
as a result is winning.
Correct.
Right. So that's a great way. So now that was about the starting the conversation, right? We are talking about the conversation, and one thing that that kind of popped into my head is when not to have conversation.
Oh, great.
One thing that we have said is like when other person is not in mood, or when the other person is going through some other stuff, then that's one case where you don't want to have conversation. Then what are the other probably cases where not to have conversations?
Beautiful, beautiful question. And I think this is often the most forgotten element of any conversation. And the most forgotten element of any conversation is silence. I've realized that I don't know how many of us really realize that the words of the letter silent are the same as the words of the letter listen.
Oh, I haven't thought about that. Yeah.
And sometimes you don't need to say something to express something. In fact, some of the most powerful conversations I've had are the ones in which so much was said, yet such little was spoken. And I think realizing that in a conversation, if there is silence creates room for breakthrough moments. It creates space for new insights. And often the sound of insight is more, Most of us think the sound of insight is aha.
Mm-hmm.
But actual sound of insight, if you really think about it, is when you're actually thinking to yourself and you're being completely silent and something has really struck you, you become really silent and you just go, because you're thinking about it. And so allowing that space for such silences in conversations is probably the most powerful thing you can do. And so most people think that you need to fill up the gaps.
So true.
In conversations. Whereas the best conversationalists I've met are the ones who create more gaps, who create more silences, because they realize that in those silences lies power, and power for new insights, new possibilities, and new connections that your brain is making, which would not happen if you're continuously speaking. So great question. And I think the right way to judge when to hold or maintain this silence lies completely based on the conversation you're having. But my favorite times to do it is to ask an open-ended question, which is why, how, or what question, and to listen deeply. My favorite way to do this is once I ask the question and when I feel like responding, I pinch myself a little bit just to see if I can stay in that silence for 30 seconds longer. And every single time I've done that, Vijay, every single time I've done that, the response I've got has been something magical. Because in that extra 15 seconds of silence, the person is able to draw upon a new insight that I wouldn't have ever given them an opportunity to do if I started speaking again. So for everyone listening, the next time you find yourself wanting to respond immediately to what someone's saying, I challenge you to just pinch yourself in that moment and give yourself another 15 seconds and see what happens. I promise you, your conversations will start becoming more powerful, more meaningful, and you as a person will start becoming a better listener.
Yeah, I can't agree more on that. And I think that also happens because the other person also wants to fill that gap by sharing more of the story that the person was sharing. Like, because sometimes we want to hold, not knowing, okay, how much should I really be sharing on this conversation? And then like you might stop in between the story, or you might not share the entire story or the insight. And then when you see that person is not responding to what you have said, that means that person want to fill that gap. And by, as a result of that, probably the person want to give you more insights and more information. And then you have that, as you have said, the beautiful insights and some of the most powerful stories. And that happens here all the time. Like, I have learned that probably a year back when I started, the power of, silence on interview, not on the conversation. I mean, interview is also conversation that I'm having here with the people, but the power of silence. And when I take that pause, when, my guest is sharing that emotional story, like most of the time it ends up, becoming one of the most powerful thing, because they share some of the beautiful stories that they would have otherwise not, because I just chose to hold myself back. And in some cases, like even if nothing comes out of it, that's totally okay, right? It's just that gap, and that's totally fine if there is no more insights and nothing coming out of it, right? So that's awesome. So that's so now one thing is you starting the conversation. Another thing is taking it forward. As you said, a lot of people struggle on sparking the conversation, but there are a lot of people who are good at it, who might start the conversation, but they really struggle on taking it forward. Like, how do I continue having that conversation, right? And then probably drive the conversation. So is there something that you'd like to say on driving the conversation and taking it forward?
So the number one thing I would say is driving a conversation requires you to be interested and not interesting.
Yeah.
Most people today want to be interesting.
Yeah.
Which means that even when they're entering a conversation, they want it to be about them. And driving a conversation requires you to be completely interested in what the other person has to say.
Yeah.
And for this to happen, you need to be curious. And the number one way to be curious is, like I mentioned before, asking powerful questions.
Yeah.
Asking questions which are not yes or no questions, which are not open-ended questions, which do not have finite choices.
Yeah.
Right? Do you want to do this or do you want to do that? The conversation's not going to go too much further, because the person's just going to say, yes, I want to do this. Here's why, and that's it. But instead of asking them, do you want to do this or do you want to do that? How about you ask them, hey, why do you want to do this? Are you being curious? And the moment you be curious, that's when beautiful, magical conversations happen. And so number one way is to further a conversation is to ask powerful, open-ended questions. The second way is most conversations fail because one of the two people in the conversation do not feel understood. And one of the most powerful ways to help and to ensure everyone feels understood in a conversation is what I call the process of mirroring. And what I mean by mirroring is, when Bijay, you said this to me, you would have heard me say, even during this conversation, what I hear you say is, what I think you mean is.
Yeah.
The reason I'm doing that is because when I'm saying that to you, I give you an opportunity to be completely understood. And by mirroring what you're saying, I'm making sure that what I've understood of what you're saying is the right thing. Most conversations, people think they've understood of what the other person's saying, and then they're responding without clarifying whether what they've understood is really true.
Yeah.
And then things get lost in translation, right? And once things get lost in translation, people end up getting hurt, and then they leave the conversation hurt. So my favorite way to keep a conversation going is, of course, questions, and then also mirroring. Constantly checking with the person, what I'm hearing you say is, and never has any one person said to me, hey, Siddharth, why are you asking me what you're hearing me say? Because everyone wants to be seen, heard, and understood.
True.
And by just doing that, you're giving them an opportunity to be heard and understood.
So you mean, one, stay curious, and two, be interested.
Exactly.
And I think, and as you said, like everyone wanna be interesting, not interested.
Correct.
Right? I think that's a really difficult one for a lot of people, to be patiently listen to somebody, right? And then just try and understand what the person is trying to say versus just trying to show who they are.
Exactly.
And I think, is that where most people go wrong on having the conversation or continue or driving the conversation, where they are more interested in talking about who they are rather than listening to the other person?
Absolutely. Any conversation requires you to say, my favorite way of doing this is to judge in the conversations I have how many times I'm mentioning the word I.
Yeah, that's a powerful one.
And the moment I started doing that, I started realizing that the more times you say the word I, the more times you're actually talking about yourself. How about you don't mention the word I at all during a conversation. Like, I challenge you, just like I challenged you to stay silent for 15 more seconds. The next time you're having a conversation that matters to you, have the whole conversation without saying I. It's so tough, but yet it creates the best conversations. Simply because it's very natural for us to bring in our own perspective into something, but very difficult for us to create enough space just for inviting the perspective of the other person wholeheartedly. And yeah, you're completely right when you say that staying curious and being interested is the two most important things in any conversation. And people think that if I don't talk about myself, then this conversation is not successful, because how does the other person know about me? You know what? When you walk away from a conversation where you've given someone else the complete opportunity to express all of themselves to you, trust me, they will remember you more than if you spoke about them, about who you are or what you do for half an hour or 1 hour. Because most people don't remember that.
Yeah.
What most people remember is not what you told them. It's about how you make them feel.
Beautiful one. Very powerful one.
And if you make them feel seen, heard, and understood, they're going to remember you for the rest of your life. They might not remember what you do, but they remember who you are. And the next time you meet them, they're going to be drawn to you because they know that you are someone who listens to them as a human being.
Yeah, I think that's a very beautiful boot. And that's one of the, I'm learning a lot here about the conversations and, how you make other person feel. It's not about just talking about yourself, but making people feel like how you are going to make them feel when you meet them.
Correct.
So that they want to like come back again and again and probably, talk to you, and probably that makes being genuinely interested. And I'm trying to, connect that with some of the people whom I admire the most, and why I want to keep going back to them and have conversation probably is because they listen to me.
Yeah.
Right. And they listen very passionately, and, they are listening to listen, not to respond.
Exactly.
Right. And also they are interested in what I have to say and make me feel I'm very important.
Exactly.
And I think when you make that, and when you are giving that space for somebody, I think people really admire you. Not just like you not only end up having the beautiful conversation, but also people start admiring you for who you are.
Yeah.
And I think your personality starts shining. Wow, that's a really good one. So now, how do you end the conversations?
Great. So just like how you started the conversation with the check-in, you end the conversation with the checkout. And there's interesting study about what makes your brain remember things, right? And one of the most important things that makes your brain remember things is when you openly voice out what you've drawn or learned from anything, from a particular situation, right? So even in a conversation, when you end the conversation telling the other person, hey, what I learned from this conversation is, instantly you've told your brain, remember this conversation. And that's what makes conversations memorable and meaningful, because you've given your brain a cue that, hey, this conversation taught you something. We don't end most of our conversations asking ourselves, what did you learn from it? Or what I took away from it? Because we think we take that for granted. And which is why most of the conversations don't even remain in our minds. But if you really think about it, the ones that where you've had the conversation that really mattered to you, you've either shared with the other person, or sometimes just shared with yourself, either through journaling or through reflection, that, wow, I really learned this from that conversation. When you do that, you basically instantly etch that conversation in your mind. So my invite to everyone is, when they leave every conversation, check out from it. Share what you've learned through the conversation, or share what was your highlight. It doesn't have to be just learning. What was your highlight of the time together? And that also helps the other person understand what was it that, really meant a ton in the time that we shared together. But also it ensures that before you start your next conversation, you've closed this chapter. Before you start your next conversation, you're fully present for the next one, because this one has been fully closed, or at least close to the best of your ability for that moment. Otherwise, again, the same loop starts. You enter the next conversation thinking about this one. Checkout allows you to close this effectively and move on to the next one.
Super. So now I'm again going back, because it's on structure. That's why we keep moving here, move a little bit further, and I, come a little bit back. So I want to, come a little bit back and talk about, you meet some of these people who can walk up to a stranger, and then they build that instant powerful connection right there with the people. and then they become lifelong friends just because the way they connect with with the person, right? And then they go really deep and try to understand who that person is. And there are some people who are really good at having those conversations and pulling out really good in connect on a more deeper level just than asking about what do you do, where are you from, and stuff like that, right? So they really go and have that really powerful conversation with these people, right? And then build that long term relation as a friend or lifelong friend or whatever, right? So now, how do you really do that? How do you really go and even when you are going and meeting somebody at an event like this, for instance, let's say, so there are always going to be people who will be going back after event and going to be friends for rest of their life, right? So how does that kind of conversation happens?
I don't know what the exact research number says. I know that research states that I think 60 to 70% of any conversation is your body language, right? And the body language is the number one thing that builds rapport. My favorite way to build rapport, personally, is often the thing that we take most for granted. It's your smile. Right? I personally am someone who will smile at strangers even if they don't smile back at me. And it might sound creepy, but it's my favorite way to build rapport. And it's also my identity now.
True.
It's how people know me. It's when they know I'm the guy who will smile at them, even if I don't know them. Right? And it might be different for different people, but that's the way I build rapport. And that's how I break the ice. Now, for you, it might be completely different. For you, it might be maintaining strong eye contact and looking at someone in the eye while before even starting a conversation. I mean, of course, not doing it creepily, not doing it creepily, but most people today have forgotten how to look at someone else in the eye, even when they're having a conversation, or even they're not. Either looking at their phones or looking away. So building rapport, I feel, has different elements. I do it through smiles. People do it through looking at each other's eyes. Other people do it by very patient listening. They might be sitting on a table and they might not have said a word, but their energy and their listening knows, that they have your attention, and so find your way of building rapport. And building rapport always comes from non-verbal, or mostly comes from non-verbal elements. And another way of building rapport is mirroring, right? So when you are seeing someone, when you sit long enough with someone in a conversation, or even if you're not speaking, you automatically start doing the same things. You start sitting the same way. Your rhythms start being synchronized, all of that. And that happens simply because two people have shared space with each other. So my invite to people who want to walk up to strangers and build rapport is be very, very attentive to your body language. And again, your body language signals whether you're out there being interested or you're out there being interesting. Please be interested. The world needs more people who are interested, not interesting.
Super. That was really insightful, Siddharth. Is there anything that we haven't covered about conversations, having conversation, or that's something that you would like to add?
I think the last thing I would like to add to everyone listening is, I really believe, guys, that the world that we live in today can change one meaningful conversation at a time. And from some of the smallest problems that we face in our families to some of the largest problems we face in countries and societies can be solved if people really sit down and talk about the things that matter. And my invite to everyone listening is to not wait too long to share the things that are in your heart and mind for too long. And one final thing I would say is, I read this book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, by a nurse named Bronnie Ware. She worked with people in the last few years before they died. And amongst the top 5 regrets, one of the regrets that people consistently came up with is that I wish I had the courage to express how I was feeling to someone I loved. From all the people lying on their deathbed, if that was amongst the top regrets, it says something, right? So my invite to you is, find that partner, find that friend, find that family member, or find that stranger who you want to talk about something to that matters to you, and don't hold back. Because guess what? By you drawing up that courage, you give them the permission to do the same.
Super. So a little while ago on this conversation, you mentioned about the life circles.
Yes.
For the listeners listening, would you like to share what is that all about?
Absolutely. So Life Circles is a space where I curate communities, conversations, and experiential activities for people to gain more clarity about themselves. And it's a space where I help people build a more meaningful relationship with themselves and with their closest circles by combining a few of these elements of games, some of which you experienced, workshops, and of course a lot of meaningful conversations around topics. And we do this in the form of retreats that happen in stunning locations around India. The last one happened in Kasoli. The next one's happening in Goa from June 4th to 7th. And it's always intimate communities. So never more than 12 to 15 people in a group. And we go really, really deep over the course of 4 days to talk about the things that matter to us. And people who have experienced it have come together as strangers and have left as lifelong friends. People they can call upon as, when they're having a really, really bad day. And I think the other thing people tell me is this is something that's best experienced, not explained. So for everyone who's listening, if this is something that sounds exciting to you, I would love to have you for our next one.
Super. So how do people reach out to you or get in touch with you if they would like to have some more insights on having conversation or probably navigate through the difficult or challenging conversation that they want to have in their life?
Oh, I would love to help in the best way I can. My best way would be Instagram. And my handle is Sid_Anantharam. It's a longer surname.
I will put that on description.
Perfect. Yeah, you can check out the description link. Or if you want to check out Life Circles, it's ourlifecircle.com. That's our website. And on Instagram, it's ourlifecircles. That's the handle, both of which will also be on the description, I guess.
Yeah.
It was such a pleasure having this conversation with you, Bijoy, and thank you for the time.
Thank you so much for being here. It's been great having this conversation with you about conversation. And thanks for challenging me for this one, not to have any structure in place, which I think I did pretty good job. Or we did pretty good job talking about this and navigating through a lot of different elements of conversation, right? From sparking to, taking it and then like ending it. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your insights, man. Always great to hear from you and learn from you. Thanks so much.
Brother. And for everyone listening, have a fantastic day, guys. And I hope you have the conversations that really matter to you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Inspiring Talk podcast. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast from. And before you do anything else, let me know your biggest takeaway from this episode on my Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @BJSpeaks. Thank you so much for listening. I'll catch you in the next. Now, go out there and do something inspiring.